With respect to liability for latent contamination due to hydraulic fracturing, I think you have at least two schools of thought. One would be that this is strictly sort of like an environmental claim, that it falls under environmental legal liability and would not be covered under commercial general liability. So if you have environmental cover, that would respond. There's another school of thought that imagines if you had this kind of problem on a widespread basis and a tort system that needed to respond, and how would that system address the damages to each of these plaintiffs. And in that scenario, if you were to argue that a hydraulically fractured well is some sort of product, say, of a company, and this company effectively made and manufactured all over the US these wells, and that this is a faulty product. That kind of argument, if it carried the day, connects more with commercial general liability and creates potentially more risk. Now, again, I think there are a couple schools of thought. I think that people I've talked to in the industry, at least as long as it remains a relatively idiosyncratic risk, look at it much more as an environmental legal liability. And so environmental cover would respond. It would be, fall under pollution exclusions if it were sort of a longer term release of contaminants. With respect to underwriting companies involved in wastewater injection, if they triggered a seismic event that led to significant damage, commercial general liability insurance would respond. There's some question about how well that would play out in court in terms of whether the plaintiffs could prove sufficiently that the operator had indeed caused this damage. Putting that aside for the moment, I would note that most forms for these operators don't have defense costs and limits. So if it's a big case with a lot of claimants, you can imagine that it's a lot of defense costs that you might be surprised to find yourself holding. Now, I rate the chance of a very large earthquake in the most unfavorable spot as pretty rare. I put that as less than a 1 in 200 year event at the moment. Done some calculations with this, but they're expensive events. You can easily imagine in Oklahoma City, a city without earthquake codes, that if you had a magnitude 6 earthquake, you'd have a lot of buildings fall down. And it's not outside of the imagination or our calculations to suggest that that's tens of billions of dollars. I think it's unlikely, but in terms of in terms of liability and risk management, it's nonetheless something that, as a catastrophic scenario, that I think it pays to be aware of. I think it pays to think about the structure of the policy, not only in terms of how it responds to damages, but how the defense costs are addressed. And in terms of risk management, if you're an operator in Oklahoma, you pretty much inject wastewater. There's not a lot of alternatives. Alternatives tend to be expensive. The best thing for the wastewater injection risk is the worst thing for the market. The fact that prices are down, production is tapering off, and that means that you have less waste being injected. Maybe that gives the industry and the state some time to come up with a better solution.